Okay, I'm going to get to the writing stuff in just a second, but first, a few words about automotive maintenance. Okay, let's say your car's making a funny noise, okay? It rattles. Now, think about this. When your mechanic pops the hood, he doesn't just stare at the engine waiting for inspiration, okay? You know, think about it. He has a process. He has a process. He looks at the battery. He looks at the carburetor. He looks at the fluids. He looks at various components of the engine. And then based upon that information, diagnoses the problem. The skilled mechanic can, let me put it this way, you can also view this process in a positive way. Let's say your car sounds great, purrs like a kitten, has never run better. The skilled mechanic, using the same kind of diagnostic techniques, can tell you why your car is running so well. I believe we can do something like this in writing. That if we use what I like to call diagnostic techniques, we can figure out what's wrong, or we can recognize what's right. Too often, just to continue the automotive analogy here, too often we're like that motorist on the side of the 405. You know, we're stuck there, the car's not moving, but we have absolutely no clue why. We're just stuck, okay? So my goal here tonight is to, I'm kind of like the AAA of writing, I think, in a certain degree here. My goal here tonight is to give you some tools that you can use to figure out what's going on with the car, figure out what's going on with the engine, or to recognize when something is really good. Because here's the thing, folks. Anyone can look at a story and say, wow, that's really good. Or say, wow, that's really bad. But it's the craftsman, it's the artist who can tell you why that sentence is really good, can tell you why that sentence just doesn't work, okay? So that's the goal. So I'm going to give you some main points, main tools, okay? And then as time permits, give you a bunch of extras. But before I do that, before I give you the keys to the kingdom, just a little bit of philosophy. A little bit of philosophy, and it's important because this forms the foundation for everything that follows tonight, okay? And I like to express this in the form of a question. It's kind of an Alex Trebek Jeopardy thing, you know. What is the most important thing in writing? Let's think about that. What is the most important thing in writing? Okay, so is it the structure, is it the syntax, grammar, the words themselves? Thank you for playing. Answer is wrong. None of the above. None of the above. Believe it or not, folks, the most important thing in writing is, drum roll, the meaning, the message, the idea. New Yorkers might say, the point. Okay? We agonize so much over how to say something. You hear kids say that when they're writing papers. I don't know how to say this. You know, we agonize over how to say something. Totally wrong. What we should be doing is agonizing over what we want to say. Okay? When you're having trouble writing, it's not because you don't use language well, it's because you don't know what you're talking about. Okay? And usually with younger reporters, no, I'm not being sexist or ageist here, it's because they haven't done enough reporting. If it's an older reporter, it's often the opposite problem. They've done such a great job of reporting, they've got too much stuff, and they can't see the forest for the trees. They're confused. Okay? But the root cause is the same. They don't know what they want to say. Because I guarantee you, folks, if you figure out the what, you will figure out how. Guaranteed. Money back guaranteed. Every time that will work. And that is my guiding principle. Whenever I get into trouble, I always go back to, what's the point? What's the point? What's the point? Some folks have worked with me here, and they know that all I ever do is ask people, what's the point? Not like that, but in various ways. And so that's the guiding principle. Just always keep that in the back of your minds. Okay, now, 3 big tips. First one, you've probably heard this before. Read your work out loud. Okay, read your work out loud. And you probably know why, because if there's something screwy, you'll hear it. If it's awkward, you'll hear it. If there are typos, you'll hear it, or you'll see them. You ever have this happen? You send like an email to someone, or you write a story, and they reply, and you read your original email, and there are words missing? And I don't mean like the little articles, like the us and the thus. I mean like big words, just missing. And you could have sworn you wrote that thing, right? Well, because your brain saw it, but if your tongue didn't. But your brain saw it, but you really didn't write it. When you read something out loud, you will catch that kind of screwiness. But here's an interesting thing about reading your work out loud. Most people do it after they have a draft. Okay? And in fact, at the LA Times, if you go by the desks of the people we consider the wordsmiths, the really good writers, their lips are moving. Okay? Trust me, their lips are moving. And particularly Sandy Banks, the columnist. In fact, she kind of says it so loud, if you're near her, you don't have to read her column the next morning, because you've probably heard it, and it's always terrific. It's just terrific, you know. But here's an interesting thing about out loudness, about out loudosity. Here's something that you might try. Compose your work out loud. I bet you never tried that. Compose your work out loud. Here's what happened. Years ago, I worked with this guy named John, and he was covering LA City Hall. A terrific reporter, better than I ever hoped to be. And he would call in the morning and pitch his stories. And they sounded great, insightful, and full of context, and sourced, and great. And then at 5:30, a lump of coal would land in my stocking. Okay, this mess would arrive, virtually incomprehensible. And I thought, you know, it sounded great at 10:30. You know, something happened between then and now. And this would happen again and again and again. And then finally one morning he's given the pitch, again, about this great story. And thank God I did this. I said, so what would your lead be? And he goes, oh, the Los Angeles City Council, blah, blah, blah. And he starts dictating a great sentence. Active voice, solid, precise. And I said, and your second graph? Oh, and I'm just typing like that, right? And he says, well, should I send you in the, the sked line, the little summary that we put on the budget for stories? Should I send you a budget line? I said, no, don't write. Step away from the computer. And no. I said, no, that'll be fine. Well, let's do this. So here's what I learned, is the act of speech organizes your thoughts for you, okay? Because here's the thing, when you're sitting there silently, your brain is a Cuisinart, okay? And the facts are the celery and the onions. And we know what happens when it goes on too fast for too long. It's mush. Your mouth, your tongue, your brain, it abhors chaos and craziness. So if you open your mouth to speak, it forces you to actually organize your thoughts. Because if you have nothing to say, you won't say anything, okay? That's what I discovered with John. So I find that I've written some great leads walking around the Silver Lake Reservoir where I live. I look like one of those crazy people. But it's a way to organize your thoughts, okay? Doesn't work for necessarily everybody, but and you don't have to recite your whole story. You don't have to dictate it, okay? But when you're grasping and confronting that question of what is your story about, what is my story about, that's one way to address it, is to talk it out loud. It will force you to make decisions, otherwise you'll be quiet. So remember that on out loudness. Okay, now the second tip is, oh, by the way, that reporter eventually went to television. He left the Times, and he was fantastic. He was absolutely fantastic because he just, looked in the camera, and great reporter, and he would say his stuff, Okay, 2, focus on your verbs. Focus on your verbs. The meaning of life is verbs, okay? Now, I've changed people's writing by just making them focus on their verbs, okay? And one, and I'm going to mention appropriately here at NPR station, Soraya Sarardi Nelson, who's in Kabul or Cairo, wherever people are shooting, that's where Soraya is, And when I started working with her at the LA Times many years ago, she was a pro. She'd been in business many years. She wrote A1 stories. And her writing was perfectly professional, perfectly fine. But I always felt it needed just a little more kick. If it were a bowl of soup, it just needed a little more cilantro. You know what I mean? Just a little more kick. And I was trying to figure out, what is it lacking? And I'm reading her stories and looking it up carefully. And I finally realized what was going on. I realized her issue was verbs. She either tended to use passive voice versus active, and we'll discuss that more in just a bit. Or even when she was using active voice, she wasn't getting the best bang for her buck. So I literally told her for 1 month, I said, Soraya, it's National Verb Month, brought to you by the National Verb Council. They're very good people there, it's a fine nonprofit organization. And I said, what I want you to do is you have to make a printout of your story before you turn it in. And you have to circle all the verbs. I said, don't even pay attention to what you're doing. Just make a printout, circle the verbs. And then look at the circled words and ask yourself, is that the best I can do? If it's active voice, can I goose that verb? If it's passive voice, can I make it active? Now, let me give you an example of what verbs will do for you. Okay, passive voice, we all remember this from English class. The man was eaten by the lion. The man was eaten by the lion, passive, okay? Active, the lion ate the man, okay? Basically, you just get rid of the was's and the is's. That's the trick. I don't know if any of you ever have trouble with passive voice. The way to solve it is this: make a printout and just circle all the was's and is's. Was, is, were, being, circle them, and then rewrite the sentence eliminating the circled word. Solves the problem instantly, by the way. But going back to this, so the man was eaten by the lion. The lion ate the man. Okay, what if we want to juice that sentence up a bit? The lion ate the man. How about the lion devoured the man? What if we want to get clinical? The lion consumed the man. What if we want to be silly? The lion nibbled the man. Okay, so we had the lion ate the man, the lion devoured the man, the lion consumed the man, the lion nibbled the man. 4 completely different meanings, and we only changed 1 word. That's what verbs do for you. That's what verbs do for you. Now, you read any story you like in the newspaper, in the New Yorker, novels, by any era. And if you actually stop and look at the verbs, you'll notice a pattern. You'll notice that they tend to be active unless the meaning dictates a passive construction, because remember, that is always the most important thing. What's the meaning? And you'll also notice that they tend to be fairly snazzy verbs, okay? And the other thing is, when you're reading this without actually studying it the way I do, you'll just enjoy the story because your eye literally follows the object the verb set into action. Remember when we were like in first grade, the verb is the action word. Remember that's what they told us, we learned that? But that's true. The verbs literally put things in motion, and people follow those things. No one says, wow, great verb. Well, I do, but that's kind of the way I am. So anyway, but look, and you'll see that writers really emphasize the verbs. Shakespeare is very verby, believe it or not. Okay, you think of him maybe to be more of an adjective kind of guy. He's not. He's earthy. He's earthy. There's this great speech from Richard II where there's that kind of effete king, the kind of guy that my brother would call a wuss. And he has this great speech where he basically says, hey, I'm just kind of a Budweiser beer nuts kind of guy. You don't have to worship me like a god. He says it a little better than that. And it's the speech that begins, for God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. Oh, man. Language like that will curl your toes, you know. I mean, but later in the speech, there's this line, and look at the verb action, where this is where he's just saying, I'm just a schmo. I'm just an ordinary guy. And he says, I live with bread like you. Feel want, taste grief, need friends. I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need friends. How much better is that than, oh, how bitter is the taste of grief, you know? And it's all very earthy, very simple language. So all I'm asking you to do, guys, is just write like Shakespeare. Okay, is that too much? Is that too much to ask? Okay, oh, by the way, I have to tell you, we have a handout for you that's going to summarize some key points of the speech. You're welcome to take notes, but it does summarize key elements. And it also is a citation list. At one point, I'm going to reference a number of stories that have appeared in the LA Times. And that has publishing dates, the author, the headline, and you can track them down. Don't use our website. The search engine's a little, but use like a Google or a Factiva or something. Okay, but I gave you the first 2 things. Read your work out loud, verbs. Third thing, word order. Worry about the word order. Put the best stuff at the end of the sentence. Put the best stuff at the end of the sentence. It's like the last note in a musical phrase. It's the last thing you hear, okay? Often when I'm editing, I don't so much add stuff or take stuff out, although I really do sometimes, is I just invert the words. Because I find people emphasize this when they should emphasize that. And let me give you an example. This comes from a, you know, actually, before, yeah, we're going to go ahead and take this. It involves a giant anteater, okay? And a friend of mine did this feature story about a road that was being built through the jungle. Actually, I'll use a better verb. A road that was being cut through the jungle in Guyana. And the story talked about bulldozers, and there's monkeys in the trees, and it's hot, and they're sweating, and they have machetes and stuff like that. And then in the middle of that story, there was a sentence. It said, giant anteaters cross the road at night. That was the sentence. Giant anteaters cross the road at night. And it bothered me. It was a really good story. But that sentence bothered me because the next sentence was about daylight and sweaty workers and insects in the trees. And I thought, why are we emphasizing night? Because the next sentence had nothing to do with night. We're in the middle of the day. And it wasn't like it was a transitional sentence that took us into the night. And I thought, well, what if you tweaked it? What if you wrote, rather than giant anteaters cross the road at night, what if you wrote, you know, at night, giant anteaters cross the road? Now we're emphasizing the road. We're emphasizing the place, because at that point in the story, we're really about place. But then I thought, what if you just wanted to screw with the reader? What if you just wanted to play with them? And you wrote, at night, the road is crossed by giant anteaters. Now you get a weak verb, but in exchange you get a giant anteater. You know, you don't get those every day. Now, let's review this just as much. Okay, giant anteaters cross the road at night. At night, giant anteaters cross the road. At night, the road is crossed by giant anteaters. I would submit to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that even though they're the same words, they almost have they definitely have a different feel, in a way, different rhythm, and they almost have a different meaning. Isn't that amazing? And they're the same damn words. It's just paying attention to where you put them, okay? Now, what's the correct version? Hell if I know. It's your story. What do you want to emphasize? I mean, what is the sentence before the anteater sentence, and what's the sentence after it? That guides us about whether we want to emphasize an anteater, or better yet, a giant anteater, or a road, or nighttime, okay? So, word order, word order, word order. By the way, I need to mention something that, you know, earlier when I was saying we agonize so much on the how, rather than focusing on the what, there's a good reason why we do that. And that's because we're writers. And we like the how. The how's fun, okay? That's the fun part. We like playing with words. And I know you writers. There are certain words you really like, and you put them in stories even if they're not needed, right? You all have those words. And I have those words. I have to confess, I have this bizarre affection for "-ine" words, as in canine, feline, bovine, you know, "-ine" words that refer to animals. And I guarantee when we get, when I'm handing a bear story, Ursine romps into the LA Times. You know? One of my crowning glories is the word leporine appeared in the LA Times, which is ever pertaining to rabbits. You can look it up in Times Online. It's probably the only story that has ever in our 126-year history had the word leporine. You know? But you have to control yourselves, okay? We must show discipline. But so I understand the whole motivation, you know. And I almost got cervine in the paper. That's ever pertaining to deer, but I decided it just didn't work, so I took it out. Okay, now, so those are the big three. Those are the Trinity. Now, let me give you a tip going to anecdotes. We're going to switch to anecdotal leads because you're working on an anecdotal lead, right? Okay. So I'm going to give you the best tip I ever got on an anecdote. That didn't come out in English, did it? How about an anecdote? And it came from a writer for Law and Order TV show. And we brought him by on the theory that we're storytellers, dramatists after a fashion. And we wanted to pick his brain. And one reporter named Duke Helfand asked him, hey, you know, Law and Order moves really fast. You know, that's the show where they have that funny sound when they cut to different scenes, you know, dong, right, you know, dong. Okay, so it's a very fast moving show. And Duke said, how do you do that? And the writer said, oh, it's very simple. When we cut to a scene, we don't cut to the beginning, we cut to the middle. That's so important, I'm going to say it again. When we cut to a scene, we don't cut to the beginning, we cut to the middle. Oh my God. I've had editors over the years tell me, make it faster, you know, make it faster. It's too slow. Condense it, move it along. But they couldn't tell me how to do it. They just told me what they wanted, but they could not articulate the how. Editors in here work on explaining the how. And so this is so bleeping brilliant. This is brilliant. In other words, when Law and Order has a scene, okay, so you have the cops and they're talking, we need to go talk to witnesses. Dong, okay. And then they show the face of a witness. You don't hear the cop say, what happened? You hear him just talking. You know, the car went by and he shot everybody. You follow me here? That's what I mean by cutting to the middle of the scene, okay? I have saved hundreds, if not thousands of column inches in the LA Times by using this technique. And the beautiful thing is you don't have to cut your anecdote. You don't lose the anecdote. You can keep it. Just start in the right place, okay? There was this terrific story that Richard Fawcett, our Atlanta bureau chief, wrote this last year. Actually, many terrific stories, but this one in particular was about an illegal immigrant named Pedro whose fate was being decided by an immigration court judge. And it's a terrific narrative. And there's this one scene where he's in the courtroom before the judge. And in one draft, we had him, they had the family waiting for him nervously in the courtroom. Pedro was brought in, he sits down, the judge walks in, he sits down, eventually someone started talking, you know. This was all beautifully written, by the way. Very atmospheric, but nothing happened. They're just walking in and sitting down. I mean, I just did that. You know, I mean, so the solution was we started the scene, taking the law and order philosophy, start in the middle of the scene. The scene starts with him on the stand, addressing the judge. Okay? It's a really simple concept. I edited a little feature once about some developmentally disabled kids who were going to a prom. And the story started with them in a limo going down the Golden State Freeway, and they're heading to downtown. And then eventually it shows up and they, you know, pile out and go to the Bonaventure. No, I mean, now if they had been drinking in the car, you know, or doing something else rather lascivious in the car, maybe we would have started. But they were just riding in a car in the freeway. A lot of us have done that once in our 2 or times in our lives. So I said, why don't we just start the story with the door of the limo opening up and out they come, okay? I have an example of this kind of lead that comes from the Wall Street Journal. They have a particular genius for doing this, and this involves a squirrel, which is sirine, by the way. Sirine is the word for squirrel. And this is the lead, and it's about a guy who would collect roadkill and cook it, and he wrote a cookbook for roadkill. And it says, the headline is, "Screech of Tires Means a Tasty Meal for This Chef." Aberdeen, North Carolina. With its back arched and its head cocked, the brown squirrel appears poised for a scamper as Tom and Francis Squire gaze at it through the cool mist. Quote, They don't get freezer burn if you leave the fur on, Mr. Squire explains. His wife glares into the open freezer at the critter, which looks surprisingly chipper, considering that her husband found it dead on the highway. Quote, whether you get it with a gun or a Goodyear, it's still the same meat, he says. Now, notice here that the door is already open. We're starting in the middle of the scene. 20 years ago at the LA Times, we would have had an anecdote about, you know, Mr. Squire walks across the kitchen, reaches up, pulls open the square. You know, I mean, we'd have all that stuff, which doesn't mean anything. Start in the middle of the scene. So that's an example of starting in the middle of the scene. Okay. Let us now talk, here's another tip about anecdotes. Okay, so let's say you've got a long anecdote and you can't start in the middle of the scene, okay? And you can't tighten it anymore. You have tightened and tightened and tightened this thing and there's nothing else to be done, okay? There's 2 things you can do with this. Okay, so you've got your long anecdote and then you've got your nut graph underneath it, right? You all know what the nut graph is? Okay, and if you don't, ask someone later. Okay, so what you can do is take the nut graph and make it the lead. Now you may have to fiddle with the wording a little bit, but you'd be surprised how often that can work. And usually it's just maybe 1, maybe 2 sentences. Take that, put it at the very beginning, and then go into your anecdote. And it'll go on unimpeded. The other thing you can do, and we don't do this nearly enough, is start your anecdote, and then at a dramatic point, go to the nut graph, and then go back to the anecdote. Okay? We don't do this enough, but it's very effective. And I'm going to give you an example. This one is ovine, which is of or pertaining to sheep. And this is about an event called mutton bustin'. Have anyone ever heard of that? Mutton bustin'? Mutton as in, you know, sheep. It's a rodeo sport where they take these little kids and they put them on the backs of sheep and they let the sheep run into the arena. It's kind of like bull riding for the little tiny kids. And someone wrote a letter to the editor that said we had succeeded in combining, we had succeeded in writing about an event that combined both animal abuse and child abuse. So, it was great. Okay, so here's the opening out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. This is by Kate Linthicum. And what's going to happen here is you're going to see a scene. You're going to see the kid getting ready to go ride the sheep. We're going to go to the nut graph, and then we're going to come back to the scene. It's 30 seconds before his big rodeo ride, and Julian Apodaca looks like he wants to disappear under the wide brim of his white cowboy hat. He's staring down at his boots, tugging at his lower lip, rubbing his teary eyes. Julian's father, a former junior bull riding champion, has a hand on each of his 5-year-old son's shoulders. Okay, hijo, he says, as somebody plucks the hat off the boy's head and replaces it with a helmet. Quote, cowboy up, okay? Cowboy up. I don't want no crying when you're out there. This is the little-known but beloved rodeo event where kids a couple of years out of diapers ride sheep, just like the big boys ride bulls. Suburban parents put their kids in Little League. In the country, where rodeo is king, parents sign up their kids for mutton bustin'. In a flash, a rodeo hand lifts Julian from his father's arms and swings him onto the back of an unhappy sheep, which is jerking around in a small pen. Quote, "I love you," Vince calls out as the gate opens up. The sheep shoots into the arena, and there's Julian, clinging tightly to its neck. Suddenly the animal cuts right, and Julian slips left, tumbling into the dirt. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the sheep kicks him with a hind hoof as it stumbles away. There are gasps all around. Then Julian stands up, wobbles a bit, and grins. How's that for a pretty good opening? Notice what happened. We had him, there. His dad tells him, "Cowboy up, I don't want no crying out there." This is the world of a little-known but beloved rodeo event where kids a couple of years out of diapers ride sheep just like the big boys ride bulls. Okay, and then, after we just quickly establish that, and that's just this little graph here, we go right back to, in a flash, a rodeo hand lifts Julian from his father's arms. Now, originally, that anecdote was all one big chunk, and then it got to the nut graph. And the nut graph would not have appeared on the front page of the paper. So it's a very simple technique, guys. Of course, you can't say the word technique, but you know what I mean. So split the anecdote. Is this making sense? Any questions so far? Is this making sense? Okay, let's talk about quotes. Let's talk about, first of all, let's have a drink. Okay, quotes. If you just need to cut just a few inches from a story, and you don't need like a hack at it, okay, but you just need to tighten a little bit, here's what I do. I scan for the quotes, find the quote, and then I read the sentence directly above it. You'll be surprised how often you'll see this, actually in published material. Things like, the president said he was dismayed. Quote, "I'm dismayed," said the president. I'm not kidding you, that gets in the paper, So, yeah, find the quote, and then lift your eyes. And you'll find that you can either cut out that sentence entirely, or maybe you shorten it up a bit, okay? It's a painless cut. It doesn't hurt anything. Now, I realize that sometimes you need to set up a quote just to make it comprehensible. And if you need to, go with God. Okay, fine. But this is a very easy technique. Okay, another thing, speaking of quotes, people aren't that eloquent, as I'm demonstrating tonight as I talk. And so, look at how many sentences you're using in a quote. If you have, let's say, 3 sentences in a paragraph where you're quoting someone, I'll bet you only need 2 of the 3. If you have 2 sentences from a person, you probably only need 1. It's almost a mathematical formula, okay? And I find when I'm just trying to ratchet down the story and squeeze, that's another thing I'll do. I'll look at the quotes and ask myself, are all the quotes conveying new information? Or are they being a tad redundant? And if so, let's lose a little bit, and nothing gets hurt. No one gets hurt. Okay. Another technique you might try, don't use any quotes. No quotes. No quotes. Ashley Powers at the LA Times wrote a column 1 that was, I wrote this down, 1,964 words, and it does not have a single quote in it. Woo! It's a tour de force. It is about a very cheery subject. It's about homeless people living in flood control channels underneath the Las Vegas Strip. Yeah, it's really lovely. She'd written about 30 inches and realized she hadn't used any quotes. And then she thought, well, just to see if she could do it, she kept writing. And it has absolutely no quotes in it whatsoever. No quotes. Okay. Here's another good technique for quotes. Let's say you're writing a narrative and you really want to put someone in the scene. Here's something you can do. Only use quotes from the scene. Don't use quotes from interviews. Okay? I mentioned Richard Fawcett and that story about Pedro at the immigration hearing. That story, which is a narrative, and that's in my citation list if you want to go read it, by the way. And it has a great video online. That story doesn't have a lot of quotes, but the quotes that do appear are things he heard, the wife talking to Pedro talking to his son, the wife writing on a blog, which wasn't to Richard, it was aimed at the world. The mother-in-law wrote a letter to God, and we quoted that. But again, she's not writing to Richard, she's writing to God. And so in that story, you really feel like you're there. And one of the subtle ways we did it, it's very slight, is there are no interview quotes. Now, there's information from interviews, okay, and we even have a sentence in there like, his attorneys, Pedro's chances for success in court were slim, comma, his attorney said. So we do attribute things appropriately, but we just don't put them in quotes. Okay, so it's a very subtle technique, but you can use that. Money back guarantee. Okay, also on the quote listing, one of the more effective stories that we had was a very short one by Paloma Esquivel, And it was about the body of a serviceman who was killed, I think, in Iraq. And it was brought back to Long Beach Airport. And she watched as the casket was brought out of the plane, transferred to a hearse, and then it drove away. And there are no quotes in that story. And it's about 13 inches long. Okay, it's not very long. I don't speak in word count, I think of inches. It's what we do at the time, so I can't tell you how long it is. How long is it? I have no idea. It's short. Pardon, what?
31 times 13.
Okay, well, you do the math. I can't do that. Short. There are no quotes in that, and it's an incredibly effective little piece of writing. Another interesting thing about that piece of writing, by the way, is it's a narrative, and the narrative took place over a period of 20 minutes, more or less. Often when we think, I want to get into narrative writing, we think it's going to be 6 months, a year, a project where I live with someone in their apartment building and describe their lives, You can do that, but a narrative can also be 20 minutes long, okay? As long as it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's kind of what a narrative is. This story that on Pedro unfolded over about a 3-day period that Richard witnessed. So anyway, narrative can be very subtle, very subtle. Okay, we talked about beginnings of stories. Now let's switch to the endings. Let's talk about endings, okay? I dare you, I double dare you, I triple dare you. End a feature story in your voice, not a quote, okay? It's scary, isn't it? Yes. And now, let me be clear. I've ended stories in quotes. I'll probably do it again. Okay. And I also, like all you writers, have had interviews where you hear that great quote, and you go, "That's it. That's my ending. That's perfect. That's wonderful. Great. No argument. No problem." But if you want to challenge yourself as writers, if you want to make yourself more observant and a little more clever, more insightful, end in your voice. You can only do that if you have complete command of your subject, okay? And I'm going to give you an example by a master of that art form, David Wharton. And David did a profile, actually it's interesting, because I brought this whole notion of ending in his own voice with David many years ago, and now he almost never ends in a quote. He almost overdoes it. Don't tell me that, Eric, okay? I adore David. I worked with him at the Daily Trojan, and I'm still reading his copy. So David did a profile of Todd Marinovich. Todd Marinovich was this former USC quarterback who then went into the pros and then was a total failure and a major league drug addict. Okay, and a number of years ago he was attempting a comeback in the Arena Football League while also battling addiction. And David did this profile that did the impossible. It made me feel sorry for Todd Marinovich. So the story revealed that he'd been a heroin addict. I mean, he wasn't just doing like cocaine and pot and stuff like that. He was a heroin addict. So the story was compelling as hell, and it ended with a quote, and it was quoting Todd saying something like, "Well, I know it's tough, but if I just take it day by day, I can beat this thing." I hated that, and it's because, well, for starters, I didn't believe it. Okay, and also they always tell you to say that stuff in the 12-step program, right? If I try to be step at a time, all that good stuff. Okay, so I said, and also, David, you're much more eloquent than Todd Marinovich, whose brain by then had been fried. Okay, so I said, Dave, is there some image, some sort of physical thing we can show that captures the ending? And he looked at his notes, and this is what he came up with, and I want to read it to you now. I do not have any Ein word to describe this. Unless we want to think of the pigskin, and that would be porcine. Anyway. Okay, so you need to know that at this stage, Marinovich is, he's trying to make it in the Arena Football League, okay? And he's in the 12-step program, and he's living with a guy named Kazarian. He's staying at Kazarian's home. You're going to hear a mention of that. These days, Marinovich stays in a small bedroom off the den of Kazarian's home. A stereo sits on the floor beside a nightstand where candles have melted down. Scraps of paper flutter on the walls, scribbled with sayings such as, "I choose to live," and "I am free today, just for today." See that 12-step talking about the time? Going back on. Marinovich is a dutiful guest, taking out the trash, stringing garden lights in the backyard, playing ping pong with his host. Kazarian says, quote, "Bugs the hell out of him when he loses. You can print that." The circumstance humbles an athlete who once commanded $1 million bonus. There are feelings of shame, wondering how he got himself into this mess. but there is also a healthy dose of fear. The next slip is only a moment, a bad decision away. Quote, a daily struggle, Marinovich says. Sometimes on the freeway, hurrying to practice or a meeting, Marinovich passes an off-ramp where he used to buy drugs. The urge arises, the exit sign beckons. Is that like a great end or what? Sometimes on the freeway, hurrying to a practice or a meeting, Marinovich passes an off-ramp where he used to buy drugs. The urge arises, the exit sign beckons. Holy moly. Oh my God. I mean, you know, it's all... you're obviously not feeling this the way I do, but it's factually true because Marinovich started using again. I think he's still in jail. You know, okay. It's totally true. His dad should be put in jail, but that's another story. We'll get into that in another section. But anyway, notice how physical that is, and also it does have the benefit of being accurate. Okay, let's not forget that that is one of the elements here. It's based on the recording. Also, notice that the verb action in what I was reading here in some of these things, the circumstance humbles an athlete who once commanded $1 million bonus. Okay. But then we use some passive things because it helps express the right ideas. There are feelings of shame, wondering how he got himself into this mess. So, you know, it's all, and I can guarantee you, David Wharton reads his work out loud. You heard how that worked, right? The music of it all. And it's a really interesting challenge for prose writers, by the way. Last year I read a fascinating essay by Robert Louis Stevenson. Remember him? He wrote Kidnapped and Treasure Island, you know, in the 1800s. I had never read Treasure Island as a kid, okay? And last year, I don't know what possessed me, I ordered it on the Kindle and I read Treasure Island, and do you know it's fantastic? It's like great. There's, you know, Long John Silver. You know, I always had like the movie version of Long John Silver and the Parrot, you know, that kind of stuff. It's really well written. It's an excellent book. And then while looking at that in the Kindle, it said that Robert Louis Stevenson had written essays on the art of writing. So, okay, I gotta order one of those. So I got those, you know, and he had a very interesting comment to make about prose versus poetry. And he said this, that in some respects, the job of the prose writer is more difficult because in poetry, you're already given a set form. You know, there's a certain number of beats to the line. There's a certain number of lines to the sonnet. You know, I mean, that's all laid out for you. But the prose writer has to create his own rhythm, has to create his own structure. So he was saying that even though poetry is difficult and has certain, you know, strictures, in some ways those rules are very comforting. Whereas with prose, it's all wide open, and that's why it's so scary. And isn't it pretty cool? I thought that was really great. Also notice that I still am trying to learn about writing. I mean, I think I can edit some things reasonably well, but I don't think you ever stop. You know, you still have to go back to our analogy, you need to be able to pop the hood and look at the engine and go, what is going on there? Oh. Also, you know, I mentioned Law and Order. I find that I'm inspired often by all sorts of media. We are surrounded by storytelling, okay? Look at commercials, look at billboards. I could not do billboards, but I'm absolutely fascinated that you see these things that have like 5 words and that's all you need. I mean, it's the damnedest thing. There are actually even commercials where they have these little dramas, and if and maybe they said like 8 words of dialogue in the whole bloody thing. You know, it's pretty amazing. Oh, you know what? I forgot to tell you one thing about dialogue, about quotes. I forgot to say it. Be on the lookout for, you can't be on for lookout because you're hearing these things. Listen for dialogue. Usually when we quote people, it's like I ask you a question, you say something, I write it down. Okay, it's a thing of beauty, it's a wonderful thing, wonderful. But often we cover events where people talk to each other. City council meetings, school board meetings, protests, people talk to each other. That's dialogue. If you have dialogue, you have action. If you have action, you have drama. If you have drama, you have the reader. Okay? I can't possibly say that a second time. One time I was covering, this is really fun, at Cedars-Sinai, there was a protest by these animal activists, and they were convinced that they were vivisecting cats, you know, at Cedars-Sinai. So it was so cool. There was a fight, and they're like flinging things, and you know, oh my gosh, the protesters took their signs and they're beating the security guards and they're fighting. It was so fun, and we got art of it all. So at one point, the lead protester hurt his neck, okay, and so they make him sit down. So he's down there like on the curb like this, and the paramedics come and they put the neck brace on him, and then they put him on a gurney, and they're starting to roll him away. And this was the dialogue I heard. And I didn't need a tape recorder to record this. One of the activists sees him rolling. She says, "Where are you taking him?" "Cedars-Sinai." "Oh my God!" You can do that yourself, you know. Seriously, there's dialogue. A coach says something to a player. Usually we only quote the coach yelling at the player. We don't quote the response. If they're smart, they won't say anything back to the coach. But the teacher says something. How do the students react? You know, finish the scene. Put me in the scene. Finish the scene. We once, years ago, during the presidential campaign of 2000, there was an event here in LA. Al Gore spoke. So he gives an address. And then after that, there was a young lady who spoke up again, in defense of, in support, I should say, of legislation to crack down on bullying. She was a lesbian, and I presume still is, and she was talking about her experiences in school. And it was a powerful quote, And so I asked the reporter, well, wow, what I was thinking, was there applause? I mean, what happened after she finished saying this stuff? You know, what happened? She says, oh, it was just silent. Like, why don't we put that in there? You know? And I said, what about Gore? She says, well, he went up to her, hugged her, and then everyone broke out in applause. Maybe we should put that in there. Finish the scene. Finish the scene. It's not just the quote, it's the context of the quote and what's happening. But trust me, seriously, if you put dialogue in your story, it's like having a little movie, a little playlet. A little movie is inserted in your story, and it instantly becomes more vivid. And it can be even routine dialogue. Would you pass the salt? Sure. I don't know why, but when that appears in print, you can see the people who are talking. It's almost magical. Okay, it's an easy technique to use. Money back guarantee. But before I got distracted here, I was saying that I find, we were talking about billboards, that you can be inspired by all kinds of storytelling as we go on in our efforts to learn about being better writers and capturing things, okay? You can learn from TV, you can learn from commercials, you can learn from movies. You can learn from song. You can learn from song. And one of my favorites, at least to make this point, is this old folk song from Texas called Streets of Laredo. And I don't know how many of you know this one. As I walked out in the streets of Laredo, as I walked out in Laredo one day, I spied a young cowboy all wrapped in white linen, and cold as the clay. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing the whole thing. However, my next number will be Il Mio Tesoro from Don Juan. Okay, but look what happened here. As I walked out in the streets of Laredo, where? As I walked out in Laredo one day, when? I spied a young cowboy all wrapped in white linen. Who? Wrapped in white linen, as cold as the clay. What? It's a lead. It's a lead. It grabbed your attention, and it didn't give everything away. Next graph, or stanza, quote, I see by your outfit that you are a cowboy. The cowboy then said as I boldly walked by. Here's the nut graph. Come sit down beside me and hear my sad story. I was shot in the breast and I know I must die. It's a nut graph, isn't it, guys? Prepares you for what's going to happen. Now notice how it tells you he's been shot in the breast. I always like to say that you can tell this song was not written by a police reporter. Because it would have been, I was shot in the torso and I know I must die. They love that word, torso. It's amazing. It's the only time you ever see that word in print anywhere, you know. 3 shots in the torso. But it's literally an invitation. Come sit down beside me and hear my sad story. I was shot in the breast and I know I must die. Okay, then what happens? Using God-given chronological order, we go back in time and we start at the beginning. 'Twas once in the saddle I used to go dashing. Once in the saddle I used to go gay. First to the dram house, that's a saloon. First to the dram house, then to the card house. Got shot in the breast, I'm dying today. Now, we're not overly specific, but we basically know he's been screwing around. Okay? He was raised in hell and he got shot. Okay. Okay, then he goes on. Get 6 jolly cowboys to carry, for a guy who's dying, he's quite the quote machine. It's amazing, you know. Get 6 jolly cowboys to carry my coffin. Get 6 pretty maidens to carry my pall. Put bunches of roses all over my coffin. Roses to deaden the clods as they fall. Notice the verb action. Notice how specific. You don't say, get me some pallbearers, and that's not just because it's hard to rhyme the word pallbearer. It says, get 6 jolly cowboys, get 6 pretty maidens, okay? And then there's a death scene in this song. There's a death scene. with dialogue. Quote, "Go fetch me a cup of cool water," the cowboy then said. I said, "Go fetch me go fetch me a cup of cold water to cool my parched lips," the cowboy then said. Before I returned, the spirit had left him and gone to its maker. The cowboy was dead. Was dead. It's passive, but it's powerful. And it's not just his rhymes, okay? Then we gotta have a funeral. We gotta have a funeral, he's dead. We beat the drum slowly and played the fife lowly and bitterly wept as we bore him along. For we all loved our comrade, so brave, young, and handsome. We all loved the cowboy, although he'd done wrong. Now notice how we're adding more details as we go on in this story. We already knew he was young, but now we know he's handsome, okay? And now we say he's brave, okay? Now the handsome, that's a somewhat vague word. It's not as specific as saying he's 6'1", 200 pounds with a square jaw, but it's a little extra detail. And what I like about this is it's adding details deeper into the guts of the story. Here's one thing I noticed with a lot of writers. They agonize so much about the opening, okay, they forget, they put all the cool stuff at the beginning, and then after they finish getting your attention, it's like, well, now I can go back to regular writing. And it's, have you ever seen this? Maybe even your own writing. It's like a ventriloquist came in, and there was like one voice at the beginning, and then another voice took over after the nut graph. Okay? And so one thing to aim for in your writing is being consistent from beginning through the end. Going back to the ends, by the way, speaking of ends, when you guys write your ending, so I mentioned, using ending in your own voice, right? But here's an interesting thought. I dare you to do this about endings too. Think about the endings when you're writing your beginnings, okay? I torture my writers with this one all the time because they agonize over their openings. They show me their top and they want me to look at it. And I, of course, say, it's brilliant, don't change a word. And I don't say that. Well, sometimes I do. Oh, they're coming. What? And anyway, they'll show me their opening and I'll say, okay, great, this looks great. How's it going to end? Steve, I've been agonizing about the beginning. I said, yeah, I know, but you got to think about the ending. Okay, now, let me be clear here. I'm not saying you need to come up with the exact words. Words will just screw you up, okay? I mean, I'm talking about ideas, because remember, that's the most important thing. What's the point? What's the point? What's the point? If you at least have a rough idea of how you want to end the story, is it going to end in a positive fashion? Is it going to be negative? Is it going to be unresolved? Okay? Maybe it will be with a quote, which is fine. If you have at least an idea of what that ending is going to be, for me, it's like the North Star. You're a sailor in the sea of words, and you got that star, and you're sailing towards it. It gives you someplace to go, okay? And that will help you make decisions. That will help you write your lead. That will help you write your nut graph. That will help you cut. That's the main thing it'll help you do. It will help you cut things, okay? And squeeze. Actually, I don't like to say the word cut. I like to say squeeze. It cuts so violent. We squeeze stories. We embrace them. We lovingly embrace them. That's what we do, So anyway, think about that. Dare to think about the ending, at least the idea, why you're messing around with the opening. Here's another key question for you to ask yourselves. By the way, any questions? I've just been kind of babbling here, because I kind of get rolling on writing, Stop me if you want. But here's the thing about a question you ask yourself, and I guess this is kind of a variation on this question about what's the story about. And I guess this might be phrased as, what's the story really about? Okay? I find that if we're going to achieve depth with stories, particularly profiles, narratives, is we have to ask ourselves, is there some greater meaning? I mean, I don't want to get too cosmic here. Well, I do want to get too cosmic, actually. Is there some greater meaning that we're missing here? And I have an example. There was a writer at the paper named Kim, and she did a story that was slated to go column 1, our showcase feature on A1. And it was about Asperger's syndrome. And this is back in the 90s, when it was not very well known. Now it's much more well known because of greater awareness of autism. And Asperger's syndrome is kind of that autistic-like disorder. People don't relate to other human beings all that well. And so she did this story about it. And it was perfectly fine. It was fine. But it kind of had a disease of the weak feel to it. It could have been about leukemia. It could have been about hard of hearing. It just could have been about anything medical. Because you had experts in the story, and you had scientists, and you had doctors, and you had people who had the affliction. In fact, she quoted people who had Asperger's. She had this this couple that had gotten married. They both had it, and she went on and on and on. Okay, so I read the thing, and I go up to her, and I say, Kim, do you realize that this isn't a story about Asperger's syndrome? Panicked look, you know. I have that effect on writers, the panic. And I said, Kim, this is not a story about Asperger's syndrome. I said, Kim, it's a love story. Kim, it's a love story. She had a man and woman who both have Asperger's, which prevents you from making contact with other human beings, and they got married, and they're buried way low in the story. It's like, oh my God, that's your story? I didn't say that like her. Literally, all I had to say was, Kim, it's a love story. And she got it instantly. She rewrote it top to bottom. I was not the editor of this piece, okay? I had nothing, I didn't see it until it came out in the paper, and it was then framed as a love story. It later became a movie, by the way. It became a movie called Mozart and the Whale. Did you see it? Did you recognize this?
I've seen it. I know that a couple of years.
You know them? Mary and Jerry?
Jerry Newport, yeah.
How do you know them?
I've actually met him.
Oh, okay, sorry, we have to stop the whole thing here. What
I've actually met him because I go to simple. I've gone to various bunches of conferences since I was in high school.
Wow. Yeah. So you know they made this movie, and he was the whale. He dressed up. He made this whale suit for Halloween, and Mary dressed as Mozart. And actually, I made two suggestions to the story. One was it's a love story. I did say one other thing. The story mentioned really low in the story that he would put on this whale suit. He kept the whale suit, okay? And he would sometimes put it on at home and kind of dance around the living room in his whale suit. And I said, get the whale suit much higher. That's my theory. Anytime a man is in a whale suit, that should be high in the story. But she wisely ignored that advice. The whales are still pretty low in the story. So I want to read to you the opening of that piece, okay, and how she reimagined it. And you have to know that the original version briefly mentioned how he viewed the world and his problems, okay, and it more like told you them than showed you them, okay. In fact, we always hear that from editors, show me, don't tell me. Do we ever explain what the hell that means? Okay, here's telling someone. Shaquille O'Neal is incredibly tall. Okay, now I'm going to show you. Shaquille O'Neal ducks every time he walks into a room. That's the difference. Okay, notice that there's verbs going on here. There's action. You can see it. Okay, now getting back to Asperger's syndrome. Precisely 28 weeks had passed since Jerry Newport had met Mary Meinl. He had been waiting for this very moment to pop the question. 28, after all, is his favorite number. First, he says, it's a perfect number. I just imagine him talking fast. I don't know if he really does, but it just goes in my head this way. First, he said, it's a perfect number. The sum of its factors equals 28. 28 is also the sum of the integers from 1 to 7, and I'm 7 years older than her. Looking back at their April 1994 engagement, Jerry's obsession with numerical perfection is both amusing and disturbing, and for good reason. It is a gift that comes at a terrible cost. Jerry has Asperger's syndrome, a neurological disorder that isolates those who have it from other people, even while sometimes bestowing unusual talents. Mary has it too, and while her gifts lie in art, she may be the only person who has ever fully appreciated his delight in numbers. Who else but Jerry could have found such significance to the landmark fig tree in West Los Angeles where Mary said she wanted the magic moment to occur? The tree, you see, just happens to be 119 years old. Quote, if you divide 7 into the number of the tree, he said, you get 17. And that's one of the numbers you can make a polygon out of in a circle. But if you square 17, you get 289. And we met on the 289th day of the year. Clearly, this couple's love story, involving everything from an exorcism and an obsession with whales, oh, the whales did get it, yeah, an obsession with whales, to a compulsion to read license plates backward for fun, is no ordinary romance. It is a story of triumph in the face of a potentially devastating but often unrecognized affliction. Okay. Now, it had the experts in it, right? It had the doctors, it had the research, it had the theories. That didn't disappear, but it was a love story. Tell me a story, guys. Tell me a story. Come sit down beside me and hear my sad story. And the other thing is, don't always let the cat out of the bag. Hide things sometimes. hide something. We agonize that about a lot. You know, today I was talking to a reporter at the paper about this story that wants to talk about a gang member who essentially had a conversion and left the gang life and now is trying to do good. And it's going to be a hell of a tale, but there's really some interesting structural issues here. And that was, do you start the story telling the reader he's now on the side of the angels, or do you try to let that just be a surprise when it happens? I mean, you could argue for either one. And then it becomes an issue of, well, what's the point? Is the story that the guy made this conversion, or is the story how he made the conversion? In other words, if you told people up at the beginning he's now on the side of the angels, the point of the story would be the journey. So see the difference between, is it a journey story or is it a destination story? Okay, and that's very important because they're not the same thing. They're related, but they are not the same thing. And these are the decisions we need to make as writers if we're going to have clarity, if we're going to be focused. Now, I know I have thrown like a semester's worth of stuff at you tonight, okay? Let's see, we talked about, you know, the Trinity, you know, read your work out loud, focus on verbs, focus on the ends of the sentences, don't forget those anteaters, you know. We talked about anecdotal leads. We talked about splitting the anecdote, like with those rampaging sheep in Santa Fe, right? We talked about starting in the middle of the scene, that fantastic tip from Law and Order, okay? We talked about having the guts to end in your voice, but that will require that you do extra reporting and that you really get to know your characters to end in your voice to be able to do that, right? We talked about quotes, getting rid of those little lead-in quotes. We talked about using dialogue, you know, these things. And so I know I've thrown a lot at you, but I can tell you this, that you can go back to the citation list and look at these stories, you know. And I can tell you this, that keep in mind, these are just tools, okay? And you can use them or you may not use them. So in other words, if using passive voice is the best way to convey your meaning, use passive voice. Go with God, okay? My blessings. If starting the anecdote at the very beginning of the scene and not in the middle is the best way to convey your meaning, do it. If the best way to convey your meaning is with a quote at the very end of the story, go for it, okay? Though it's all up for grabs, total up for grabs. But the thing that is not up for grabs is this. Let the meaning control the word. Don't let the word control the meaning. Let the meaning control the word. Don't let the word control your meaning. And if you do that, I swear to you, you will have work that is very muscular. It'd be like a bull. That would be taurine, actually. And it might actually have kind of a sleekness to it with power, like a lion. That would be leonine, you know. And it might increase the odds that you won't write anything that's asinine. Thank you very much. You've been very indulgent.